All right, guys, so we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to go slightly out of order of what we normally do to wrap up virtual learning. Since we only have a week left, I know we've kind of been talking about the Cold War, which is still going in this time. We're going to kind of jump and focus for the rest of this week on the civil rights movement, okay? So we're going to be talking about the late 50s into the 60s and just talking about how the civil rights movement progressed. What we're going to look at is kind of first civil disobedience, or kind of these nonviolent protests where you're intentionally violating a law, but you're doing it in kind of a peaceful, nonviolent manner. And then we're going to look at more radical movements that stem out from this nonviolent movement. Okay, so today we're going to focus on kind of just looking at the background, some of the things that created and sparked the civil rights movement. Okay, so just a refresher from what we talked about, kind of the end of American History 1. So remember we talked about the Civil War amendments, which were the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. Remember the free men vote were a way to help you remember that. And remember they were relatively successful during Reconstruction while the military was there to enforce it. When Reconstruction fails and the military leaves the South, the 14th and the 15th Amendment are no longer really being enforced by the government. So it's being ignored completely. African Americans are not getting equal treatment. They are being disenfranchised. They're not able to vote. We still see segregation, discrimination really prevalent in the South. So at the end of Reconstruction to what we talk about with this modern civil rights movement, there's almost 100-year gap where these laws are not being enforced. So civil rights up to this point is not going to be successful because the government is really not enforcing these amendments or this legislation that was passed to protect people of color. Okay, so just a little background information. So remember we talked about Jim Crow laws were ways of socially excluding people of color, setting in this discrimination and segregation, and overall just limiting rights of African Americans. Okay, when we talk about segregation, segregation is going to essentially be legalized under the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, that dates all the way back to 1896. Remember, for almost that 100-year period, separate but equal was kind of this phrase that ruled everything. And we know that separate really was not equal. But again, they're going to use this court case to justify segregation, especially in the South. Okay, we're going to see this court case, Brown versus Board of Education, which we'll look at a little bit more in depth a little bit later. But this is going to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so for the sake of the civil rights unit, in general, you very much so need to associate these two court cases together and understand that Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas is going to overrule this idea of separate but equal. In segregation, and specifically targets the integration of schools. When we talk about the Warren Court, we look at that a little bit more when we look at 70s culture as well in the normal American History 2 semester. But Warren is just, he was the head Supreme Court justice at the time, so kind of gets nicknamed after him. Okay, so main thing, so again, what are we kind of fighting against? Those Jim Crow laws. This idea of separate but equal with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and then it's going to be overturned by Brown versus Board. Okay, so during this time period, okay, we still see kind of racism, segregation. When we talked about World War II, remember we talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, but for the most part, those African American soldiers are still serving in segregated units. But they were willing to go into Europe, fight for their country, risk their lives, but they were still fighting against segregation. So they kind of called that the Double V campaign. So victory over Nazis in Europe and victory over racism at home. Okay, so this is going to lead eventually to Executive Order 9981, where Harry Truman is going to integrate the military. Okay, so he is going to pass this, makes a step to integrate the military. Okay, other stepping stones. Okay, Jackie Robinson becomes the first African American Major League Baseball player. Okay, so again, he is making milestones for African Americans. Okay. He is very publicly discriminated against even at these games, suffering from racial slurs and things like that. And he still kind of perseveres to become this public figure, very famous, very talented. Okay. Another person that is definitely significant in this time period of making milestones is going to be Thurgood Marshall. Very popular name. I'm quite sure that you've probably heard of him before. Lots of things get named after him for his legacy. But he becomes the first African American Supreme Court Justice. So we see that time start to change kind of in the late 40s, early 50s, but we still have a long way to come. Okay, so really, Brown versus Board is going to be kind of one of the early things that is going to spark this resistance and spark this modern civil rights movement. And we're going to see different organizations. So remember, we've talked about the NAACP, or the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, has already been fighting for equality, has fought in several different lawsuits to help get equal rights for African Americans. Okay, so they're going to play a large role in it. And we're going to see other organizations kind of led up. We're going to see Martin Luther King Jr. Become a huge part in this movement. One of the early ones after Brown versus Board of Ed kind of sheds the light on segregation. Rosa Parks is going to infamously refuse to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Okay, this is violating a law that said colored people had to sit in the back of the bus. And again, this is an intentional act. Some people kind of think this was not planned or accidental and it started a movement. No, Rosa Parks was very intentional about her actions to kind of spark that change. She is going to be arrested, again, violating that law about bus segregation. Okay, from this is going to spark the Montgomery bus boycotts. Okay, so when we talk about a boycott, you are literally refusing to be a patron for a business. Okay, this begins to hurt economically with these bus companies. Okay, so again, what impact could these have? What impact did these protests have? They're hurting them in the pockets, they're hurting them economically. So that begins to take a huge toll on these bus companies. Okay, and this is going to be one of the first examples that we see of a nonviolent protest. Okay, they're not causing a scene, they're not doing anything other than refusing to use those bus companies. They're refusing to spend their money on those buses that are segregating them. Okay, so not causing violence, not causing a disturbance. So again, the idea is civil disobedience. Okay, they're simply going to hurt them economically by not spending their money there. Okay, this is where we see the rise up of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so when we see his background, he is a pastor. He is going to be the spark of this nonviolent civil rights movement. He is a member of several organizations and helps organize these people with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Again, organizing these nonviolent protests. And then he also kind of helps inspire and organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which we will see later on is responsible for the Senate movements. Okay, so again, this is kind of setting off and setting the tone for this whole nonviolence resistance.